Hey, if you've been watching me for a while, you'll know I have a complicated relationship with the casting of Frank Stone. Despite the fact that I only really like 2.5 Supermassive games, I would consider myself to be a fan. The studio has immense potential, and with every release I find myself hoping that this will finally be the story that really does it for me, a perfect synthesis of their unique brand of horror and the interactive movie genre. Maybe going into all of their games expecting them to appeal to me specifically is a bad idea, but that's the decision I've made, and by now it's kind of my job to make that everyone else's problem. To give an extremely brief, spoiler-free review for anyone who might be interested, I'll say that if you really enjoy Dead by Daylight's lore and Supermassives' formula, then you'll probably enjoy this, but for everyone else I'd give it a miss unless you can pick it up on a sale or something like that. It's fun at points, but most of the fun is found right at the very end, and the first half is a bit of a slog. That's all I can say before spoilers, so please click off now if you want to avoid them. I'll provide some context and go over most of the relevant plot beats, so you don't need to play this game, but you'll get the most out of this video if you have. If you go back almost a year to my videos on Until Dawn and The Quarry, I was so sure that the casting of Frank Stone would be the game. Pulling lore from an established universe with a pre-existing fandom and accumulating everything the studio had learned from 6 prior titles, I was so sure that this would be the one to finally make me feel like the studio's vision and the studio's product matched up in a beautiful union. How on earth could they possibly mess this up? So imagine my anguish when it was just okay, extremely okay in fact, the platonic ideal of a 5 out of 10, neither good nor bad, the single most 50% game I've ever played. The casting of Frank Stone broke my heart. If you want a very quick analogy to explain why, this long, confusing and meandering game effectively acts as a prologue to another game's loading screen. Many of the endings are literally what you see when you're waiting for your friend to hop on Dead by Daylight. This story's thrilling conclusion is the literal most boring part of another. The problems don't end there, however, so let's do a rundown of the background, the game itself, and why exactly I'm so incredibly mad that hundreds of thousands of people have seen me delusionally telling them that this will be the game to root for. Thanks to the members. If you're new, press the nice buttons to form a parasocial bond with me, and if you want more people to talk about horror with, join the Discord. Plugs done, let's go. Dead by Daylight is a game where you and 3 other people try to restart generators to escape from a map within a time period. Another person plays as a killer, and their job, perhaps unsurprisingly given their title, is to kill you and prevent you from starting said generators. This takes place in a series of locations called Trial Grounds. Lore-wise, Dead by Daylight pulls killers from all over the place. People like Ken Konecki, Dracula, Michael Myers, Matthew Lillard, and a load of others show up to kill you. This is because of this being called the Entity, which brings killers and survivors alike into their thrall for a kind of entertainment. The Entity comes into worlds by ensnaring individuals and driving them to depravity before pulling them into the trial grounds of Dead by Daylight. The Entity is multi-dimensional, that's why it can bring in characters from Halloween and also Scream, which is a universe where Halloween is established to just be a movie.
Halloween.
Both of these stories can exist as something tangible and real within the scope of an endless multiverse. These killers aren't always big hitters like Pyramid Head or Vecna, sometimes they're run-of-the-mill evildoers like Frank Stone. Frank Stone has almost no motion in the trial grounds, he isn't even considered a real killer and you can't play as him, but he's still a big enough deal to potentially end the world. That's the scope of things here. Going forward, all you need to know is that the Entity is this big cosmic force of evil who can destroy entire worlds, but in order to do that it needs to corrupt a killer to weaken the veil between the realm of the Entity and the world that is being invaded. There has to be a lot of ritual murders going on before the Entity even shows up. Once the Entity has entered the world, it pulls people from the vicinity of the killer to act as survivors. The Entity feeds off their emotions and repeatedly kills them to feast on their fear or lets them briefly escape to foster hope. Every time a person dies, they lose some of their soul and thus get less tasty, so the Entity must keep getting new survivors from newly conquered worlds. Imagine a horror movie themed Galactus. I hope you're with me so far because this is the backdrop to the casting of Frank Stone. It takes place in one such world where the Entity is trying to enter and get a new killer and a few new survivors. The game does try to explain this, but most of Frank Stone will only make sense if you already have this knowledge going in. This isn't strictly a bad thing, the game is openly a Dead by Daylight game, so I don't expect it to completely explain the premise to newcomers, but it could be a bit better at conveying the core concepts. Okay, that's the background, here's the actual video. The casting of Frank Stone is not a single story, rather 3 similar stories set in slightly different universes. As stated before, Dead by Daylight is multiversal, but where other multiverse stories get quite wacky and high concept, in the casting of Frank Stone the universes are simultaneously very similar and divulge in very strange ways. This may seem oxymoronic, but whilst characters can die in one timeline and live in another, which seems like a big deal, the plot events play out the same regardless. no matter what a movie gets made, and the movie is always used to summon Frank Stone to queue up his killer in 2024. The game has to end in Dead by Daylight becoming real, so no difference can be so drastic or noticeable that it deviates from the set order of events. Things that need to happen for the plot always happen, irrespective of timeline. So the timelines are always similar, irrespective of how different they might seem at face value. First positive note here, this game looks really nice. I ran into a fair few minor graphical corruptions during my playthrough. I'll put some footage on screen now of Linda's hair getting messed up, but outside of this the game is far and away the best looking by the studio. Now you might say, no shit Ratat, it's the most recent release, and to that I'd say, okay, that's a bit hurtful. However, seemingly due to some law of equivalent exchange which ensures every good property about this title is met with an equal and opposite bad one, this beauty is offset by the camera being the worst it's ever been. The environments aren't really designed around the camera, and as such it's always compressed against walls with the character's head taking up like 80% of the screen. Sometimes it goes completely through the character and briefly goes first person. It's terrible, even compared to certifiable tight corridor simulators like Man of Medan and The Devil in Me. There are 3 timelines you play in, 1963, 1980 and 2024. In 1963, Sheriff Sam Green finds and kills Frank Stone, a serial killer. He saves a baby Frank Stone is trying to kill, or doesn't if you intentionally fail the tutorial. But after this you shift to a timeline where everything is the same and the baby is alive. The game literally cannot happen if this baby isn't saved because he grows up to be a main character, so your entire universe ends and you get shifted over to one where you made the choice the game wants you to make. The timeline shifts and changes at various points to force you to do a certain thing. Very strange. This is what I'm saying about the timelines. Things change, but never in ways to do anything but shock you or actively undermine a choice you might have made. If you failed the tutorial, that's the end of that timeline. You're never going to see anything to do with it again. For shock value that adds very little, there's no better example than Bonnie. After the 1963 prologue, you start playing as this girl called Madi in 2024. Maddie's mum, Bonnie, has recently passed as we're shown for a PTE clone segment followed by a Little Hope jump scare. However, in the 1980 timeline, Bonnie literally always dies. You can't save her. This is because the game wants to shock you with a cheap death that you won't have seen coming. It does things like this pretty often. More so than any other title, there are a lot of gotcha moments where stuff is set up in 2024 and then undone in 1980. This creates a lot of shocking moments, but only further cements just how completely irrelevant the 1980 timeline is. The 2 major timelines, 1980 and 2024, are so disjointed that they feel like entirely different games. You will not make a single choice of any significance in 1980. It will usually play out exactly the same, even if absolutely everyone who can die does die. The important ones still show up in 2024. The most impactful bit of crossover is when 2024 Sam Green can see 1980 Sam Green die on film and pull a sort of mildly shocked face. This is a shame because I like the 1980 segment a lot more than the 2024 one. It has a more defined identity, better pacing, more likeable characters, but sadly it feels like a pointless story with no real conclusion because it exists as just one of many timelines that lead up to the lengthy Dead by Daylight lore dump that is the 2024 timeline. The major events of 1980 always play out exactly the same even if you put the controller down and just ignore the entire thing, because it exists purely to add content to the game and contextualize some of the 2024 timeline. 2024 is the only timeline that matters. All of the other ones, which could be interesting ways to explore the characters or explore the setting, are just there for padding, don't matter at all, and don't factor at all into any of the major plot points of the game. Since the timelines are so disjointed, let's talk about them each in isolation before talking about the game proper and then finishing off with my usual character tier list and analysis for a bit of fun.
Wait, Chris, we just spent all the money.
Emergency sock quarter!
Emergency sock quarter?
The 1980 timeline is so Stephen King, I feel like it's about to randomly give Robert magic powers. Especially in a post-Stranger Things world, I think you'd be fair to call it a bit derivative, with both its aesthetics and its story. At literally any moment it feels like Duran Duran could start playing and it would feel apt. But to be honest, Supermassive are in that element when they're just throwing a load of tropes and cliches into a blender and seeing what comes out. This is what they're good at, and it's no different here. The dialogue can be a bit cringy, but it feels natural and is at times also quite endearing, and this segment actually has very consistent thematic overlap, being the Murder Mill movie itself. All of the characters have a reason to want to make the movie, and their conflicting visions for it, both what they want out of it and how far they'll go to make it, creates natural points of both conflict and bonding for the entire cast, save for Sam Green and Frank Stone, but they have this sort of murder-husband relationship where they both really want to kill each other. Jaime wants to make a movie to spend time on something fun with his girlfriend. Bonnie and Linda are sort of pretentious sapphic creatives who want to make this high-art movie. Chris is profit-motivated and has the ethics of a true crime YouTuber.
Stone's victims were real people. This was a real person.
Yeah? So?
And Robert is a horror fan who's just along for the ride. The creation of Murder Mill is a brilliant setup. It has a defined location, it organically ties the characters to Frank Stone, the camera acts as a gameplay mechanic for some fun, almost Fatal Frame-esque segments that add some much needed variety to the Supermassive formula, and the parts where we get to watch this gang of teenagers try and act provide some much needed comedy.
God damn you! God damn you for forcing me to make this impossible choice!
1980's pacing is somewhat killed by jumping back and forth between 2024, doubly so on a repeat playthrough when you know the two timelines have almost nothing to do with one another, but if you put the two side by side in an it-like halfway time skip, then 1980 has by far better pacing. If it was its own game, it would be a better standalone game than 2024. It has a clearly defined beginning, middle and end, it doesn't take too long for the horror to set in, it also has moments of levity and tenderness between the slasher movie gore fest. 2024 by comparison has almost nothing going on but very boring people in grey suits talking in brown rooms until the final chapter of the game where every single choice, death and ending is determined. 1980 opens with the initial trio of Jaime, Linda and Chris filming before their camera is broken when Sam Green startles them, telling them they can't film in the mill. The group buy a new camera from the game's main villain, Augustine in disguise, and recruit Sam's son Robert to help them with the movie. Headed to the mill, they shoot some scenes and meet up with Jaime's sister Bonnie, who is there to watch the shoot. The group finish the movie and are about to leave, but Chris is so intent on getting shots of the workshop of Frank Stone, being almost obsessed with the story of the local serial killer. It's this intent that somehow awakens the spirit of Frank Stone, who attacks and potentially kills Jaime after Chris is sucked through a portal into the boring half of the game. After this, Linda fights Frank Stone with a camera, Bonnie dies, Robert runs away, and Sam Green shows up and maybe dies, maybe doesn't, before Linda also maybe dies, maybe doesn't. No matter the outcome of this timeline, 2024 remains unchanged. Sam and Linda show up even if they die here, and Jaime is always alive in this timeline even if he died in 1963, because he's the baby Frank Stone kidnapped in the prologue. So, despite having fun aesthetics and a better paced narrative, 1980's timeline is by far the least consequential. It's a long series of choices that mean nothing, but without it, the game has almost nothing to do. Almost no gameplay, no tension. It ceases to be a game and becomes a very slow, very tedious movie, because my god, the 2024 timeline is absolutely nothing.
Do we just go in?
Why are you asking me?
'Cause you're a grown-up.
So are you, Maddie.
Then, here we go. Apparently...
The 2024 timeline is the Dead by Daylight exposition dump, the most tell-don't-show thing I think I've ever played. If 1980 was a charming supermassive game with the vibe of a mid-tier Dark Pictures title, 2024 is a load of characters with no chemistry hanging out in a dull, grey English manner, giving content to the Dead by Daylight wiki. I understand perhaps I exist outside of this game's target market. I'm sure a lot of this is very interesting to Dead by Daylight loreheads, but this game does very little to make it engaging for newcomers, and the pacing is so atrocious that I can't imagine even the most avid wiki reader would play and enjoy this game if it was only the 2024 timeline. There are 7 chapters that take place in 2024, and with the exception of 2 deaths in the 5th chapter, which happen to expendable characters Stan and Madison, every single major choice and character death takes place in the 7th. 7th out of 7 chapters. These are the choices and deaths that will determine your ending. Speaking of endings, there are 18 endings in this game, but that's kind of a misleading number. 2 are Easter eggs, 1 is a post-credits DVD lore thing, and 15 are nearly identical, with the exact same monologue from Augustine. All that changes is who shows up to the Dead by Daylight loading screen. 15 almost identical endings, all of which are determined in a single chapter, being the Massacre at Geraint Manor, which is the last chapter in the game. This game takes about 6 hours to complete, but the time you're actually expected to actively play it and think about anything is 5 hours and 50 minutes in. So prior to this, what's going on in the 2024 timeline? Well, there's a lot of references to better games for you to look at, a handful of mildly interesting puzzles, and a lot of multiversal stuff that just kind of hints at slightly more interesting timelines taking place off screen. Sam Green shows up talking about all these crazy off-screen scenarios, and all the player can really do is go, wow, that's crazy. Can I see it?
I'm in the best shape of my life. And everything I'm telling you is true. All of this is because of what happened back in Cedar Hills. What's happening then, right now. Don't you understand what I'm saying?
No. I'm sorry.
Wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
There's a room towards the end of the game full of artifacts from timelines with more defined differences and variants in the characters, and it genuinely made me upset because I would much rather be living in the timeline where literally any of these were the focus of the game. 6 out of 7 chapters and 15 out of 18 endings are just sort of self-referential yap sessions. It's complete quantity over quality. Whilst in the 1980s, the Scooby Gang are fighting for their lives in the most wild situation known to man, 2024 we're listening to this dude Stan talk about his Letterboxd reviews, and this is the part you're supposed to care about.
Living and dying by the light of the moon? Transcendent. Blood on the brain? Mandatory. Forgotten flesh. I don't even know where to begin.
All right, okay.
All of this standing about is just a setup for Augustine summoning the entity and then doing the classic villain, "Oh no, the ancient evil I summoned was evil to me as well as everyone else. How could I possibly have seen this coming?" trope. It's cliche and tropey and not in an endearing way like the 1980 timeline. Once again, murder mill is what ties everyone together, but in 1980 the characters are actually invested in it. In 2024, Madi doesn't even know what the movie is, and Stan is a shameless grifter. All of these characters will basically always just end up in an endless death dimension too, so choices once again feel meaningless, and with all of the major choices occurring within a few minutes of each other, your entire experience will basically be defined by how awake you are for the last 10 minutes. I understand it's meant to be a slow burn and 1980 exists to add some pacing, but I just don't care at all about the 2024 characters. They're walking exposition dumps and none of them seem to even slightly like each other. So why should I care when the game randomly decides it wants me to actually wake up and play the finale? Even if I've fallen asleep and put down the controller and absolutely everyone dies, the ending monologue is still exactly the same. There is minimal difference between good and bad endings. In Supermassive games I've critiqued for nothing mattering, like Little Hope and Man of Medan, there are still numerous outcomes for the characters and distinct endings. This is a new low in terms of narrative catharsis. On subsequent playthroughs, I will admit I had more fun when I kind of embraced that nothing mattered and the intention was to explore the lore of the setting more so than making major decisions, but the game doesn't prime the player to do that. It starts with the classic Supermassive some choices will result in living, some choices will result in dying thing, but very often this just isn't the case. In most Supermassive games, there's a good variation of deaths that happen because you simply clicked a bad option and deaths that occur due to you failing a number of checks. In Casting of Frank Stone, almost every death is either set in stone from the beginning or a result of you choosing the bad option from two binaries with almost no wider context, and absolutely no skill checks involved. Bonnie always dies and so does Stan. Robert always lives, same with Jaime in the prologue. Even if he does die, who cares, because it wasn't a canon moment, even though everything Sam did prior to him dying and immediately after is canon and happens in every timeline. Jaime always lives. Confused yet? Some of these facts seem completely arbitrary. Robert always lives so he can give the film reel to Stan, but Bonnie always dies and she always lives to give birth to Madi because the game needs a shocking twist. It's like sometimes the timelines are the same and sometimes they're different, as though factionalism in the writing team led to Stan being from the 1980 timeline and literally everyone else being from somewhere else. Maybe that is the case, but at this point it's so convoluted that it's really hard to care. If the only character from the 1980 timeline in 2024 is Stan, a character who was off-screen the entire time, then that changes quite literally nothing. So why is Robert, of all people, randomly invincible? Supermassive games sometimes have characters that can't die until the very end, but that's usually because said characters are essential to the plot. In this game it just seems like they pulled names out of a hat as to who does and doesn't die at random points. I think I would have preferred there to be either more consistency or the differences between the timelines be more pronounced. I would like one very concise narrative or three very different narratives to drive home the multiversal point. There's so much space to play around with this concept. The characters even get access to a dimension-hopping time machine halfway through and almost never use it apart from sending Chris back to the fun timeline or for secret endings. It's infuriating how close they come to doing fun things and then slam on the handbrake to have another dull brown room discussion. It's either one interesting timeline or three interesting timelines. I do not want three dull timelines. This contributes to the overall impression being that very little matters. What few explanations we do get are surface level and poorly explained, and the game slowly ambles towards a dull conclusion where almost nothing changes irrespective of your input. So let's review the finished product here.
You don't know for sure? Yeah, I work at the mill, not in the mill.
The complete product here is just strange. It's like watching an incredibly boring movie that pauses to show you glimpses of a better movie every now and again. 2024 is a dull grey timeline where nothing happens until the end, and 1980 is a pretty fun horror game that you are consistently pulled away from and frequently reminded does not matter. I think this game could have worked better if 1980 and 2024 either had more overlap with choices mattering earlier rather than all being compounded into the final chapters, or far more distinct as though you're playing two separate horror games like a mini anthology. Now, this would require some reformatting as 2024 confirms certain things prior to 1980 tackling said topics, but shifting some chapters around could fix this quite easily. At the very least, I wish 2024 had better pacing with more important events occurring earlier rather than almost every single choice and death being in the very last chapter. In Supermassives' better received games like Until Dawn and The Quarry, the pacing is miles better, the characters have so much more to do, and the threat, vibe, and stakes are clearly established a lot earlier, giving us more time to do actually interesting things and a lot less long conversations about nothing. 2024 doesn't need to be a total gore fest immediately or anything, but having at least some tension or threat prior to the very end would work wonders for retaining player interest. 1980 and 2024 don't have to be the same timeline. I understand the game isn't supposed to be linear, but perhaps finding film strips from 1980 in 2024 could help clue the characters into the mystery and let them explore different outcomes when confronting Augustine. Or instead of Sam Green showing up in 2024, it could be Robert, who always survives, allowing the player to get a more clearly defined link between the timelines than Chris, who knows nothing about Frank Stone, so her going to 2024 changes nothing. Maybe these wouldn't work, maybe I'm completely wrong, but I'm just trying to make the point here that the game should feel more connected rather than being a series of disjointed stories that interrupt each other from time to time. All of this has a lot of potential. 2024 has an interesting setting if nothing else, and Augustine isn't a terrible antagonist. 1980 is straight up good when it actually gets going. It has some of the best innovations to gameplay added to the Supermassive formula and is a genuinely interesting plot. The issue is a lack of synergy. The game undercuts itself rather than being complementary. A more cohesive casting of Frank Stone would be a phenomenal game, but this of course is a lot easier said than done. It's presumably very hard to write 3 distinct timelines and have them all feel relevant. That's why we don't have it here. This is not to undermine the successes of the game. The primary issues are the narrative. In terms of how it looks, how it feels to play, it's honestly not bad. On top of all of that, I've heard a lot of Dead by Daylight lore enjoyers have a lot of positive things to say, so I'm sure that community had an absolute blast with some of the revelations offered by this title. That said, I can't be anything but slightly miserable when discussing this game on account of how many shortcomings it has from a purely narrative perspective. Sorry, but for all the time it's taken to make this video, I really don't have that much to say about the casting of Frank Stone as a product. It's just sort of beige. However, for old time's sake, let's talk about my takeaways on all the characters and finish as we started the Supermassive series almost a full year ago now with a complete character tier list.
When you say nobody, does that include Merlin?
No, Tom, it does not. I'm talking human investigators only.
Sam Green is probably the best character in this game. Sam is a character who remains consistent across timelines for the most part. His personality is demonstrated through gameplay, with almost all of his deaths being tied to trying to protect or save someone else, and most of his gameplay segments see him actively endangering himself to try and help others. His dialogue, gameplay, and all of his story outcomes all match up to create a cohesive character, which is a rarity in this style of game. Usually there's a disconnect, but Sam Green feels like a wholly conceived character with a set arc and consistent values to do not fall victim to any kind of ludonarrative dissonance. He rarely overstays his welcome. Usually his arrival means the game is about to get going, the prologue is concise, he sets in motion 1980 and then arrives for the big finale in 2024. By not being present for most of the slog that happens during the first part of the game, Sam manages to remain enjoyable as a character due to not being associated with any lulls in quality. The ultimate fate of the characters, to be trapped in a sort of purgatory trying to escape from Frank Stone, feels the most apt for Sam. Where for everyone else it feels like a shallow reference to Dead by Daylight, for Sam he has already spent numerous lifetimes across numerous universes dedicating himself to protecting others from Frank. The title of the game, The Casting of Frank Stone, in part refers to how Frank Stone was cast as a villain, created by circumstance and manipulation to be a killer fit for the entity, like a casting in a movie. If Frank Stone is a curated villain, Sam Green is a curated hero. The two are intertwined through the folk mythos of Cedar Hills. They cannot exist without one another. Stone and Green are opposing forces on a multiversal scale. In every single universe, Frank Stone was trapped in the mill by Sam Green. In the final universe of 2024, the two return to duke it out, and so it will be until the entity is done with them. Each is cast in a role to fulfill a greater cosmic entity's will, an ironic subversion of Sam's belief that he is subject to a higher calling. This is all very conceptually interesting, but sadly Frank Stone isn't much of a character in terms of development and motivation, so Sam's interplay with him is largely relegated to implication through the clues. That said, for his almost archetypical role as a protector in the mythos of Frank Stone, Sam Green and his ultimate fate, regardless of how a player chooses to play him, all ties into the understated yet obvious theme of stories and how we are all cast in roles that are determined by our relationships and a wider situation. Frank Stone is a perfectly moulded killer. Sam Green is a paragon hero, willing to sacrifice himself for a higher calling even after seeing evidence of him dying in pursuit of prior attempts. Regarding the game's central connective tissue being the movie Murder Mill, Sam Green is still relevant as he's the number one opponent to the film getting made. His role as protector inadvertently sparks Chris's interest in Frank Stone, leading to the game happening. This is also good character writing, a character's defining trait having positive and negative outcomes and still staying consistent. Sam rarely changes, but the context and situation he's in is ever shifting, which allows him to be a driver of the plot whilst he himself undergoes very little change. This is a static character done right. S for Sam Green tier, off to a good start.
I started going out with you because you were really fun, and making this movie was really fun, but this isn't very fun anymore.
Chris is a bit of a weird character. She has a pretty clearly defined path and role in the creation of Murder Mill, then she gets sucked into 2024 and can either go back and do almost nothing or can stay and again do almost nothing. She gets derailed very quickly despite being such a driving force in the first half of the 1980 timeline. Chris is a major part of the creation of Murder Mill, and her fixation with Frank Stone and utilising his legend to create a profitable product, irrespective of ethics, is a major part of what causes his return to the world. So she's a pretty big deal in terms of narrative until she gets sucked into the time machine, or the horologium as the game calls it. But why does Chris specifically get sucked into the horologium? Why not anyone else? I'm not particularly sure. The horologium is pretty badly utilised as a plot device. Augustine uses it to pull alternate versions of herself from across the universe to aid in her plans, but Chris isn't Augustine. This was a pretty popular theory at the time of release, but it's since been debunked, so I guess just wrong place, wrong time for Chris. There's no meaning to it. The issue from the horologium onwards is that neither 1980 or 2024 feels quite like a complete story for Chris. She's stuck between two incomplete arcs. Back in 1980, very little of substance happens to her and her screen time is limited. In 2024, she has very little interaction with Sam and Linda, so her character feels out of place irrespective of player choice. This creates the issue that Chris falls off pretty heavily in the latter half of the game, which is sadly the far more interesting half. All of this combined with a sense of humour and personality, which can get a little bit much at points, means that Chris is pretty hard to feel any kind of strong emotion towards. C for Chris tier, but I promise I'm not just picking tiers based on their names.
I have to.
No, you don't.
You know that's not true.
Well, maybe I'd feel better if it were anyone else.
Who else is there?
But it's not fair.
No one said it was.
Already lost Mom and Dad. I don't want to lose you too.
Now who's being unfair?
I love Jaime. He's really funny. Andrew Weldon Dennis does a great job playing both a teenage boy and a teenage boy doing an impression of an actor.
My mind. Alright, you alien scum. Do your worst. I can take it.
Jaime is also a character that plays well into preparedness, which is something I've been saying for a long time is something Supermassive should play into more. Chris getting pulled through the portal and Jaime trying to help will always result in him dying unless the player previously purchased some firecrackers which he uses to escape. This is both a fun Dead by Daylight reference and an example of players needing to not just make choices in the moment, but make them a long time in advance. It expands the scope of player engagement, which is a positive as it makes the game more than a series of binary choices broken up by cutscenes and puzzles, and makes it more of an engaging interactive movie with intersecting parts spread across chapters. Interactive movies as a medium can only ever develop by making choices more than just yes-no branches and rather complex webs of overlapping narrative and player decision. This is a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, Jaime suffers the most of any of the characters in this game from the supermassive effect, which is a term I've used before to describe when a character survives a potential death and then completely runs out of content because presumably the devs don't want to waste time on a character that a lot of players won't have around anymore. This has been an issue since Until Dawn, and there have been very few steps to resolve it outside of Comrade from Man of Medan and kind of Jess from Until Dawn, which is funny because those were the first two games in this style by this studio. I understand it's a bad usage of developer time to just add story to characters that won't be around half the time rather than fleshing out stuff that everyone's going to see, but it does help make playthroughs feel more unique and fleshed out rather than playing into the same regardless whoever lives or dies. If everything's the same no matter what, what's the point of making choices? When you compound this with the fact that 1980 is irrelevant to the plot regardless, and almost every other character death occurs so late into the game that Jaime feels like an outlier for having such an early death, it adds up to make it so that Jaime is a fun character until he isn't. He massively runs out of steam after Chris goes into the horologium. Jaime's weird as well because he's implied to be important, someone that Frank Stone really wants to kill for ritual reasons, but whether he lives or dies doesn't matter at all in the grand scheme of things, nor does anything change. This major plot point that the entire game opens on just kind of gets dropped and the players are expected to just forget about it, the same way they're prompted to just kind of forget about Jaime the second Chris goes to 2024. So, whilst I enjoy Jaime for his personality and the humour he brings to the early game, a lack of interesting gameplay and an arc that falls off a cliff halfway through the game limits him from being as good as he could be. B tier, he's fine. I like him more than most of the other characters because he made me laugh a couple of times, but there's still a long way to go with Jaime.
Okay, I'm not 5. I don't believe in ghosts.
You will.
Ah, get off me! Get off me!
Gotcha.
Not cool, Bonnie!
I like Bonnie, so it's a shame she always dies. She plays well off Jaime and Linda, already having established rapport with them. She effectively gets capped by the narrative to try and shock the player and give Madi a bit of a spook, which is cheap, but before that she's fun, if a bit too edgy at times. Bonnie doesn't serve much of a plot function, but I can't say the game would be better if she was removed. She's a fun additional character who introduces some conflict and doesn't overstay her welcome. Jaime and Linda already have defined relationships with her, and that allows her to facilitate characterization for them while still standing on her own as a character. It's a shame we don't get any segments playing as her, and there's no way to save her, especially because her death kinda comes out of nowhere and feels very forced, but up until that point she's interesting. I fear at this point I'm starting to sound like a broken record, and I will probably continue to do so. Bonnie is fine until she isn't, inoffensive but nothing special. Remember at the start of this video when I said this is the most 5 out of 10 game I've ever played? That extends to the majority of characters. It's hard to be overwhelmingly positive, but also all my criticisms are laced with caveats. Nothing is entirely bad, everything is just completely average, almost offensively inoffensive. C tier for Bonnie, I told you I wasn't just going off of names. Moving on.
Yeah, you sure don't see coin like this working in the library. Actually, you don't see any coin. It's volunteer hours.
Robert is definitely a character in this game. He's got scenes, he even has dialogue. Every Supermassive game has a character like this, a guy who just kind of hangs about and has a handful of scenes, but doesn't actually do all that much by way of actually impacting the story. This is actually consistent with Robert's characterization. He's a character who's kind of an everyman who can substitute in for other characters where required. Robert is introduced as being a casual fan of horror and kind of friendly with everyone. The game teases a love triangle between him, Jaime and Chris, but since Chris kind of loses all relevance about halfway through and Jaime does as well, this never goes anywhere. Robert then leaves for most of the story just to show up at the end and facilitate the ending, being a sole survivor if everyone else dies. Robert also lets everyone into the mill at the start, so he facilitates the plot, has hints of a character, and does very little outside of that. So Robert's fine, he's a serviceable character, but he got me thinking about how this game functions on a level unlike any other character. He's a substitute, so characters can die and the 1980 timeline can still conclude. He ends it if nobody else can, and Frank Stone gets trapped in the camera. I understand the need for this character, is what I would say if the 1980 timeline was in any way related to 2024, but is it? The 2024 characters giving over their film strips aren't in any way related to 1980. They might be dead in that timeline, and in that timeline there's no way Madi was born. 2024 is not 1980, it's not the same timeline, so why can't Frank Stone win in 1980? If he wins in one timeline, does he win in all of them? Is that how it works? If that's the case, why doesn't Augustine just go back in time and kill Sam Green? She can do that, right? She can time travel, right? Maybe she can only travel between dimensions, but Chris uses the Horologium to go back in time, so why can't Augustine? Is she stupid? Does Augustine not know she can do that? If everyone died in 1980, would that be a good or a bad thing? Would it end every single timeline, or would nothing happen? Does Frank Stone need to be trapped in the camera and then revived? That doesn't happen with any other Dead by Daylight killer. In what way does Robert capturing Frank Stone in 1980's timeline have this ripple effect that causes Augustine to need to go to 2024's timeline to get their movie strip? They're meant to be separate, no? This opens up the impossible can of worms, which is the bizarre canonicity of events across timelines in the casting of Frank Stone. Why does 1980 need to play out that way? Why does 2024 need to play out that way? The game constricts you to a very tight linear narrative, but none of the dominoes across the timeline seem to line up. Here's another example. Frank Stone can complete his ritual and kill Jaime in 1963, but this is never brought up again. Jaime survives in every other timeline, so did he win in that timeline? Probably not. Does he win if he kills Jaime? That was kind of his whole thing, right? The major sacrifice that summons the entity, but no, he only wins if he gets summoned to Augustine's house in the year 2024, even if he only kills Stan. Is Stan the chosen one? Stan? Really? When you map out Augustine's plan, it's completely insane. The plan is to create a killer by manipulating Frank Stone, let him die in 1963. If he does a ritual sacrifice, that's great. If not, no biggie, who cares? Then across an infinite multiverse, she has to create a movie and get a limited cinematic release. This movie will always be made by Robert, even if everyone else dies, so she has to give Robert immunity, then get copies of that movie from an alternate universe in 2024, so she can play it on a screen which summons Frank Stone. Here, Frank Stone can completely fail to kill all of the main characters, but he does kill Stan, which summons the entity, who I guess is a huge Stan fan. Then Augustine gets killed, because what else did she expect would happen? This is nonsensical. Why is Stan the guy who pushes it over the edge? Augustine says the timeline she chose was special, but why? Her reasoning is that the entity is very close to these worlds, but why is this entity so invested in the boring grey world of 2024? 2024 doesn't seem all that special, and 1980 and 1963 are straight up Frank losing timelines, even if the player is actively trying to let him win. Frank sucks, no wonder the entity gives him no game time.
Yeah.
coach would have put me in fourth quarter, we'd have been state champions.
Does Frank ever win in any scenario? Is he just a multiversal loser? I assume so, because if he wasn't, Augustine could probably just go to another timeline, grab Frank, then unleash him in 2024 as he was in 1963. He was already a prolific serial killer then. How is it that he can only win if he specifically kills Stan in 2024 after crawling out of a TV? How does that work? Does Frank Stone need to be a TV monster as part of the entity's plan? The Trapper, the Huntress, a lot of the Dead by Daylight killers are just kind of regular people. So why does Frank Stone need to be supernatural before his killings actually do anything? What's so special about Stan? What's so special about Augustine's house? Because in a playthrough where a player keeps everyone alive, Stan's death, or Augustine's house, is the thing that triggers the entity to show up. Or does the entity just show up when Frank Stone does? If that's the case, why not in 1980? He had to die, then get caught on camera, then brought back for a third time before anything happens? Why? Maybe I'm missing something, maybe it is explained. I'm sure there's an explanation someone can give me, and I'll be sure to highlight any comments to make sense of it, but why is it this exact order of events? Now, if the game was more branching and variant, I'd give it a lot more leeway, because stuff has to happen for the game to happen, right? But where it's so linear and so hyper-focused on everything playing out this exact way across 3 exact timelines, it makes it seem like this is the exact thing that needs to transpire before the entity can show up, and there's no logic to it. All of that is to say that Frank Stone's timelines are convoluted, as many stories become when they introduce time travel and multiple dimensions. Robert's essential status just highlights this, because realistically him being invincible in 1980 is purely a plot device to facilitate the movie getting made, even though the movie should still exist in 2024 regardless of what happens in 1980. Why can't you lose in 1980? Why is there a scripted win? It's the same with 1963. Augustine could get the movie from literally anywhere. Hell, it could be found footage even if everyone dies in 1980. Everyone in the movie being dead is a staple of the found footage genre. This game doesn't allow worst case scenarios to happen except in 2024 where it always happens. Surely the completely irrelevant timeline should be more sandboxy and allow for greater player choice if they don't matter at all in the end. Why limit choice in the segments when nothing matters anyway? Surely you want them to be out there and engaging and interesting. The point of multiverse stories is to explore wild alternate universes, so why keep all the universes so rigidly uniform in service of a plot that doesn't need that? It seems counterintuitive to the format. You have 3 largely similar timelines all serving one average narrative, when you could have 3 vastly varying timelines to at least add some flavour. Robert is symptomatic of this larger issue. But as a character he's just fine, C for Crobert tier.
And there's no such thing as a wide close-up.
Or an extreme shot.
Or face acting. It's just acting.
Does anyone even care that I'm the director?
Linda, alongside Sam, is kind of the main character of this game, but 1980 Linda and 2024 Linda are completely different people. This is confirmed early on when 2024 Linda talks about seeing Bonnie after the shoot of Murder Mill, but in 1980 Bonnie always dies at the shoot. We kind of need to talk about both Lindas as kind of separate, kind of the same. Some points will overlap because, as always, this game is confusing with the timelines, but the characters are technically different. I didn't do this with Sam because Sam is basically the same guy all the time. Linda is slightly different depending on the timeline. 2024 Linda does a lot of very slow walking and talking. In contrast, 1980s Linda is where it's at. She has the most fun gameplay segments. Her and Sam are the only characters who get through the cool little shooty camera thing. 1980s Linda is always striking a great balance between tension and action, the synthesis one wants to create when making an enticing survival horror experience. Linda has natural chemistry and defined relationships with the rest of the cast. She has vested interest in Murder Mill being the central connective tissue of the entire project, and she serves as both a calm voice of reason and a driving creative force simultaneously without compromising her character once. She never feels like she falls victim to the plot or acts out of character in service of it. Her segments are genuinely enjoyable and there are numerous ways you can play her. Again, this is difficult to pull off, having several dialogue trees which feel distinct, but none of them out of character. 1980s Linda is a vaguely pretentious young creative with aspirations to create some artsy-fartsy movie, so I'm definitely biased towards her given my interests, but I think just about anyone can find her segments fun. She's at times witty but not overbearing with her attempts at comedy, and she's nowhere near as wooden as, say, Robert. Her relationship with Bonnie is sweet and sincere, and to an extent this carries over to 2024 with how she treats Madison. Linda is one of the few characters we see at various points in her life, and it's easy to see how 1980s Linda could become 2024 Linda. Her dialogue in 2024 also does a good job of giving us better insights into her character, but 2024 Linda is also by far the worst character. More on that in a second. For now, let's rank 1980s Linda in S tier because she's fun to play as with a well-defined character and role in the story, and that's all I ask for. 2024 Linda has almost all of the positive traits of Linda, but instead of using them for interesting set pieces and developing relationships, she stands around Augustine's house doing very little, same as all the other 2024 characters. On top of that, 2024 Linda is revealed to not be 1980 Linda, but rather a Linda where the shoot went fine and the film released, so she's not the Linda that I enjoyed playing as so much, which makes me like her less. As with all the characters from the 2024 timeline, she's just not given anything to work with and it sucks, so C tier.
Oh, you're American.
Yeah.
So am I.
Okay.
Madi might be the most millennial character ever put in a video game, and to be honest, that's fun. She earnestly hits some of the corniest dialogue going, and that plays well into Supermassive strengths. I can see why some people wouldn't like her, but to me she's an inoffensive player insert with just enough motivation to make her believable. Sadly for her, she exists only in the 2024 timeline, which means that 6 out of 7, or 85.714% of her screen time, is just sort of hanging around in Augustine's boring mansion. Even if she was 1,000 times wittier and more introspective, I really doubt the game could do anything to make me like her more than just a little bit. Where characters in 1980 can be kind of average and get carried by the intrigue and threat of their timeline, Madi has to carry entire scenes purely through dialogue, and sadly she doesn't really have the presence to do this. So where other characters' shortcomings can be overlooked due to them being in legitimately interesting situations, Madi is almost always being focused on as a point of dialogue, as the 2024 timeline slowly plods its way towards actual content. Madi is kind of a victim of the timeline she's placed in. I don't think in isolation she's any better or worse than Jaime or Bonnie, the other Riveras, but sadly she is incredibly underutilized. The game attempts to play around with Madi's trauma and gives her brief scenes of introspective psychological horror. This is how we're introduced to her, and perhaps if developed more, this could have improved the 2024 segments, allowing some battles in the center of the mind to add some much needed tension or faster paced segments throughout this timeline. Sadly, this, as with so many other things here, is surface level only, interesting in implication rather than execution. For this reason, it's hard to have any kind of strong emotion towards Madi, so similar to Chris, I can at best put her in C tier.
I was taking a look around before, and let's just say I'm surprised it hasn't been condemned by the local authorities.
Stan the man! Stan is insufferable, and his entire role in the story is to show up, be annoying, and then die. It's genius. They created a character that almost nobody could possibly find likable, and then brutally murder him irrespective of player choice. Almost like a peace offering to the player. The devs are going, hey, look at this really annoying, really obnoxious guy. Now look at him getting killed. It's awesome, really. The devs extending an olive branch like this. Outside of this, I really don't know what they were going for with Stan. He has almost no interesting dialogue, almost nothing to contribute to the plot, he'll never be present during an ending, you don't ever get to play as him, or learn anything about him. You also don't learn anything from him that you don't learn from clues or other characters. He's completely redundant outside of just padding the already extremely long, extremely dull 2024 timeline. Usually around the time Stan dies, you're in the fun part, the final chapter, so Stan dying is kind of a wake-up call. The game only gets good after him. He exists only in the dull parts. He's a spectre of boredom that hangs over the absolute worst part of the game. In spite of that, I kinda love Stan. I don't know if it's the negative consequences of simping for Emily from Until Dawn for years, but every time Supermassive introduces a character to try and make me dislike them, I always end up liking them almost in spite of them. Because these characters introduce conflict, break up monotony, and always just have the most insane dialogue. So yeah, Stan's annoying, he's insufferable, but his borderline unhinged dialogue pulls me out of the stupor of the 2024 timeline. Stan kinda sucks, but I like him for that. I'm willing to bet I'm in the minority here because I don't foresee there being a huge standum out there. Maybe we can be the first Stan Stans, you tell me. No idea where to rank him, so let's just go C, because he's objectively bad, but this is my subjective list, and I don't want to put him in D, even though that's where he belongs.
The ritual disrupted. My key mangled. Yet Frank Stone didn't die that night.
Augustine isn't a terrible villain, but she isn't great either. She acts as a shadowy puppet master who is largely present on the sidelines, but rarely directly involved. She speaks between each segment, a bit like the curator, but without the personality. Augustine fulfills her role well as someone who provides additional Dead by Daylight lore, which was previously unknown. She's extremely useful for people who are interested in that aspect of the game. Her entire house is basically a wiki article. Whilst I find her to be pretty generic, and her big "oh no, the world destroying evil is destroying me, a part of the world" scene so incredibly cliche that it made me wince, it's hard to deny that she alone carries most of the "from the world of Dead by Daylight" tagline on the cover. She's a functional character that provides the context that a certain audience wanted from this game. Whilst I personally dislike her and don't think she contributes all that much, she gives the developers a natural way to incorporate a lot of the game's concepts, and she doesn't just act as an exposition machine, she facilitates the plot in numerous ways and does take an active role which can be compelling. As stated in Robert's section, Augustine's plan is, at best, incomprehensible, and the more you think about it, the more insane it gets. This is only an issue if you overthink everything like me though. As an archetypical schemer who operates in the shadows, Augustine plays her part serviceably. If you only think about this game in terms of tropes and what things are supposed to be, then it's fine. Augustine works in the abstract, but the longer you sit and think about what she's doing, the more you realise she's several villainous tropes in a trench coat masquerading as a character, disguising her incompetence and general lack of direction with flowery language like she's writing a Ratat video. What the hell, who wrote that? Augustine is a lot of ideas without much substance, a recurring issue with Supermassives characterization, condensed into a singular character. Have you guys seen the Potential Man meme? That's like all of this studio's villains at this point. That's what it's like. There's for sure ideas at play, I understand what she's supposed to be, but I'm expected to meet them halfway to fill the gaps of this character. For this reason I find Augustine frustrating, even though I can't claim that she's completely awful. C tier? Noticing a trend, this entire game is C tier. Moving on. Frank Stone is a perfect killer for this game because he ironically seems to be reflective of my feelings on the title as a whole. At times he's interesting, at times he's generic. He has numerous clearly defined phases, some of which I like and some of which I despise. He is a character of contradiction with an implication of depth but a lackluster implementation. Perhaps then there is no better mascot for this game. Frank Stone as a character has a lot of character traits told to us through clues, but almost none of it is shown. He's instead simply a mindless monster who loses his more interesting design to almost immediately become a generic flesh monster. His initial design is revealed through clues to be something he discovered in dreams, the look of a brutal industrial animal designed to strike fear. In this design he shows you so much about him, his animal nature, his craftsmanship, his rugged industrial background. This design is dropped in favour of a generic flesh monster look. Frank Stone is said to create unique weapons for each victim. This could be a way to incorporate more inventive murders and combat set pieces. This doesn't happen. He just attacks with his hands and this bone knife thing. A lot of the kills are kind of the same. There's so much implicit characterization that was written into notes but simply never incorporated. Frank Stone, the supposedly perfectly crafted killer, feels half-baked, and the closer he gets to his goal, the more he deteriorates in quality. Perhaps this is the point. A tortured and victimized man reduced to a mindless killing machine, always in the service of something, be it Augustine or later the Entity. There is tragedy here, and his mirrored arc with Sam Green has an implied tragic determinism which underpins the entire game. This is an understated story that I appreciate. However, these small victories and minor details do not make Frank Stone stand out. In the complete roster of the Entity's killer collection, he's insignificant. He's directly compared to some of the best in horror and comes up short because he isn't particularly interesting. And many of the things we find out about him through clues and files don't come into play, like the people writing the clues didn't tell anyone else what this character was all about. What we had was a brilliant design with a lot of interesting lore wasted on a pretty bad implementation. I'd really like to see a 1963 Frank Stone game, or have him make another appearance somewhere else. There's a lot to him. It's a shame we see him reduced to what he is for the majority of this game. B tier, because I kind of see what he's supposed to be and I don't wholly dislike him, but there's a lot to be desired with Frank Stone. So, thanks for watching. I know it took almost a full calendar year, but I finally got up to date on Supermassive projects. If you ignore the fact I still haven't made videos on the Until Dawn Remaster or movie, or Hidden Agenda, or several of the other projects that I forgot. I'm taking a small break from Supermassive for a while to focus on some of the more out there projects I have knocking around in my noggin, so the next few uploads might be a bit odd, but I hope you'll stick around for them. I'll be back in October with more Dark Pictures anthology. Let's hope Directive 8020 is the game to root for. If it isn't, I have no idea what I'm gonna do. Until next time, bye.